Hello there and welcome back to my channel, or if this is the first video of mine you are seeing, then welcome. I have two eyeshadow palettes right here from my collection. Both of these have been discontinued and I want to revisit them to see if they're palettes that I even really want to keep in my collection. And the first one here is from ABH. This is the Subculture eyeshadow palette, which I really love this color story. I don't feel like I have another palette in my collection that has something quite like this. I mean, maybe similar, but not spot on for sure. I understand there was apparently some controversy when this palette originally came out. I got mine from TJ Maxx, and I know they re-released the palette, so I don't know what batch this came from. But I will say that I've used it maybe a few times in the past and I don't remember having any issues with it, but I'm going to be using it in today's video just to see if it's something I want to keep in my collection or not. And the same can be said of this e.l.f. and Chipotle, oh, I don't want it to reflect, this eyeshadow palette right here, which also quite a unique color story for my collection. I'm sure I have these shades individually, but to see them all laid out together like this, I don't really have anything quite like it, but I want to give this palette another chance as well, just to see, is it really something I kind of want to keep around? But we're going to start with the ABH palette today. And I did let a random number generator just pick out my 5 shades. I will use this palette again, of course, off camera and everything, just use it a few times just to see if it's something I really want to keep, but for the sake of the video, I'm going to be doing one look each with both of the palettes. So this is the color story that it picked out for me this time. We have Cube, Rowdy, Adorn, Roxy, and New Wave. I love this shade. Look how pretty that is. So pretty. Okay, the only things that I've done off camera are prime my eyes with my Milani eyeshadow primer, and then I did set my eyes with some powder. So on a Sigma E24, I'm going to mix the shade Roxy and New Wave. We're just going to mix the two of these together, just like tap back and forth. And let's run that into my crease. Do any of you still have this eyeshadow palette? Or maybe you were really into the makeup world when all the drama with this palette. I really don't know the full thing with that. I came into makeup later, so by the time I got really into it, this palette had already been, like, it was gone. I shouldn't say that. It might have still been available at the time, I'm not sure, but it probably was on its way out, but I managed to find mine at TJ Maxx a few years ago. So I have no idea if this was from like the original batch or if this was from the second batch. I'm assuming probably the second batch, because I think they brought the palette back out. Oh, I just dipped back into those two shades to kind of build them up a little bit more. I don't remember struggling or anything with this palette, but I just thought it would be nice just to start revisiting the eyeshadow palettes in my collection, especially ones like this that are discontinued, because, I mean, of course I can still get use on them, but I mean, they're not something that I can actually say, yeah, you can go buy this if you want, because it's not available anymore, and I just want to see if it's still worth keeping around. And then I'm just dipping into a skin tone powder just to kind of go around the edges of this a little bit, just to make sure it's blended out nicely. Okay, and then of course we're going to just do the same thing on this side. I'm only going to do one look each. First, I'd like to use the palette more like off camera as well, just to kind of see if it's something I really want to keep. But I am going to be so honest, these shades like this, these really warm orangey leaning shades, I'm not a fan of. And I feel like there are a few tones in here that are more on the warm tone side. And I don't know, I just haven't really been wanting shades like this very much lately. I just feel like I've been leaning more towards like neutral tones or like cool leaning tones. Now, I did absolutely purchase the ColourPop and New Moon eyeshadow palette. I did purchase that, but I will say that had more to do with the movie and me liking the movies when I was younger than it did the actual palette, if I'm just going to be so honest about that. I mean, I'm still gonna do like a review on my channel, but I bought it mostly because I just always liked those movies and the books. And we're just gonna go in with a skin tone eyeshadow just around the edge here, just to keep that nice and cleaned up. Those shades are pretty together though. They're just not like, I'm just not into these tones right now. Okay, on a Sigma E54, I am going to take Adorn. No, you know what? No. Actually, I'm not. I'm going to take that shade on my finger. I think that'll be better. I am wearing some shorter press-ons, and this is a very pigmented shade. Yeah. So it actually might be better to apply it with my finger. And we're just going to apply that about halfway. I might have to go back in with a brush in just a second, just to kind of, you know, go around the edges, of course, but let's just do this first. That shade is really pretty. It's really pigmented. Now I'm going to take my, what was this one? The Sigma E24. You figured I would know by now. And then just kind of go around the edges a little bit of that, just to kind of clean that up some. Here, I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Of course, I'm going to tell you, you don't really have to pick up a lot of this eyeshadow. It is pigmented. Like, I mean, I didn't pick up too much. Of course, I'm going to go around the edges a little bit with that brush, just to make sure it's nicely blended. You know, I might have completely been out of focus then when I was doing that, but I'm just, you know, lightly blending around the edges again just to make sure everything's nice and cleaned up. Okay, then I'm going to take the shade Cube. Also going to take that on my finger. And we're going to place that right in here. Ooh, that's pretty. Pick up a little bit more and kind of really go over that. And that does have like a slight shift to it. I mean, nothing that impressive if you are someone who uses a lot of indie brands, but I mean, for a mainstream brand, they normally don't have shades like that, or I feel like they don't, so I like that shade. If that shade was, if these were magnetic pans, I would honestly take that shade out. Like, keep it as a single, because I just think it's so pretty. But honestly, I think this is the type of palette you'd have to destroy the whole palette just to get the shades out, which I don't like that. I wish more brands made their palettes like where you can easily remove the pans without destroying the whole palette, because honestly, I think I'd keep that one shade and maybe that electric shade and then put them in like one of those little palettes, empty palettes, and then let go of the rest of the palette. But I mean, I'd have to destroy the whole palette just to get those two shades out. I don't really want to do that because I really like that shade. Yeah, I honestly think in this eyeshadow palette I'd keep these three shades and then maybe this gray kind of like a gray. Is that like a gray? Let me swatch that. Yeah, it's kind of like a really more cooler tone brown. And then let me swatch. I'm going to swatch like the ones I would keep just for funsies. Yep, there'd be the four shades I'd keep. It's hard to show you, especially this one, because I accidentally mixed this one in with that one, but that is this shade right here. But honestly, I'd keep those four and I'd let the rest of the palette go. And I've seen people do that, where they'll take apart these eyeshadow palettes and keep the ones they want, and then they'll pass on the singles. Maybe if I could buy, I don't have any of those palettes, but if I can buy some of those magnetic palettes, like those single palettes, and you know, then maybe buy like another one and put the rest of the shades in that one, and I could pass them on to a friend or something, or a family member, and then I can just keep the shades I want from the palette. It's an idea. Okay, I'm going to go in with the shade Rowdy, and I'm taking that on a small angled brush from e.l.f. And I'm just going to line my lash line a little bit with this shade. Not a lot, just a little bit. just to add a little, well, it's a little something. It's nothing too intense. Yeah, this is it's a pretty eye look, but I still feel like I'd only want certain shades from the palette. And I've definitely seen, like, project panners, more so, do that. Like, they'll take apart an eyeshadow palette and they'll keep the shades from the palette they want, but then they'll pass on the other shades, and honestly, that's actually a really smart thing to do, because then I feel like you're not having to keep the whole palette just for like 4 shades. Maybe not right now because I don't have any of those magnetic palettes, but it would be something that I can maybe do in the future. Alright, I'm going to take my Smashbox and Becca under eye corrector, and we're going to go ahead and go on the under eye area. And then I'm going to take my Ilia True Skin Serum Concealer, which I have really been enjoying this concealer for this month. It's in my everyday makeup drawer for January, and I've really been liking it. It was kind of one that I had placed, not on a chopping block, so to speak, but just kind of wanted to see how it performed this month, and that would let me know whether or not I wanted to keep it, and I am going to be keeping this one. I do like it. Okay, I'm going to mix Roxy and New Wave again. I'm going to run that all along my lower lash line. I didn't dip in too much because I didn't really want a lot. And you know what? Just for fun, it didn't pick this shade, but I'm going to try it. We're going to take the shade Electric, and we're going to pop that on that inner corner. Ooh, that's pretty. Kind of swoop it in here and then take it a little bit on the lower lash line as well. Yeah, I definitely think I want to keep those 4 shades from this palette, for sure, because I love that pop of green next to this shade. I just think that's really pretty. So can you imagine, instead of using what I did in my crease, used the shade Dawn, and then on the outer portion I could have used the shade Mercury, and then like in the center Electric, and then on the inner corner and maybe even in here the shade Cube. Yeah, I might really have to try to take this palette apart and keep those 4 shades and then part with the rest of it. I wish I could do it without ruining the palette, but I don't think you can. But if you know a way, please let me know. But there is the eye look for this palette. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the rest of my makeup off camera, and I will be right back. Okay, so here is this completed look. So just right quick, the blush and lip that I'm wearing is the Haus Labs Color Fuse Glassy Blush Balm, and this one's in the shade Glassy Pomelo. I'm wearing that on my cheeks, and I did tap a little bit of it onto my lips. And that's all I'm wearing to go with this look, but I do really love the eye look. I still think I'd be happier with those 4 shades from this palette, but I do like the eye look. But I'm telling you, I love that pop of that shade Cube, which that was the name, yeah, because there almost looks like a little bit of a pinkiness to it, and just, I don't know, I really love that. I love that little bit of green. I do think it's a pretty look, but I still think that those 4 shades in the palette would probably be my favorites, that I'd probably get the most use out of those if they were the only ones in my collection. So it is something that I might consider. I do want to use this palette a couple more times using a lot of the other shades, because this is a 14 pan palette and I only used 5 of the shades. I would like to, of course, use more of them, especially like some of these greens and this more bluey kind of tone. You know, this more kind of like a burgundy looking color. I would like to use more before I made my final decision, but I still think that those 4 eyeshadows that I showed you swatched on my arm, I think those would be my best bet. But now that's the end for this palette, so we're going to move on now to the e.l.f. Cosmetics and Chipotle palette. Okay, we are going to be moving on now to the e.l.f. and Chipotle palette, which is wanting to reflect. I just let a random number generator pick out my shades again, and these are the 5 shades that it picked out for me. So we have corn salsa, black beans, white rice, hot salsa, and brown rice. Geez, these names, that just kills me. The only thing that I've done off camera is just prime my eyes and set that with some powder. So, okay, who do I want to start with? I guess I'm going to start with that hot salsa shade. So I'm going to take my Sigma E24 and I'm going to go into the hot salsa shade, which is that bright orange. And then I'm going to start running that into my crease. I feel like this was another collection from e.l.f. that was really short-lived. Like, it sold out, I want to say, in no time, and then, like, they never restocked or anything. Of course, I feel like they don't really restock their collabs, and they just kind of moved on from it, and I don't know. I think I remember seeing some videos around the time with this palette, but I feel like I haven't seen it since. At least not from, like, creators that I watch. I'm not saying that nobody out there doesn't use it. This might be somebody's everyday eyeshadow palette. But at least on YouTube, from the creators I watch, I haven't seen anyone mention this palette at all. I think that it's kind of unique in a way. Well, the collab itself is unique. I mean, Chipotle. But I don't know. I think there's only really one shade in the palette that's actually kind of unique to my collection. And unfortunately, the random generator didn't pick that shade. I'm just taking a skin tone eyeshadow and going around the edges of this just to make sure it's nice and blended out. I just feel like that's the only shade. And what is that shade called? Fajita. It's this shade right here, because it does have, if you can see it, a little bit of a shift to it. I feel like that's probably the only more unique shade in the palette. The rest of the shades are, you know, I mean, maybe not together, but are more of like common shades. So I just feel like that's really the one shade in the palette that has some interest to it. I'm kind of, you can definitely build this up full pigment, because honestly, I feel like at full swatch, you can make it look like traffic cone if you want, but I'm just kind of blending it out and keeping it more on the softer side for my preferences. So I feel like you can still see it, but I've really kind of almost like diluted it down. I just don't want that full pigment. Okay, on that same brush, I'm going to go in with the shade Black Beans. Also, the shade names are on, like, I can't show you because I have a mirror, but they were on a piece of plastic. They didn't have the shade names actually wrote on the actual palette, so I kept the piece of plastic and taped it to the mirror so I could tell you the shades. Let's tap that right out here. You know what? I think I'm going to veto a little bit of one of the shades. The reason why is it picked two golds. It picked this one and this one. I'm going to get rid of one of them, and I want to use that green shade, because I feel like that's kind of a really large pan in the palette, and I want to use something a little bit more, you know, interesting from the palette instead of just the golds. So I'm going to switch one of the gold shades. I think I might switch out the lightest one and keep the shade, like keep the more bold one, and then swap out the lightest one, because I really want to use one of those greens. And then I'm going back in, of course, with some skin tone. This time I'm using a skin tone powder, because my poor little single shadow is getting to the end here. So I'm just using a skin tone powder just to work around that edge a little bit, just to make sure that's nice and blended. Okay, and we're going to take the Black Beans shade over here. And then we're going to switch it up for the inner part. Instead of using one of those golds, I want to switch and use one of the greens. I feel like that makes the most sense. And pick up a little bit more of that shade and press it in here. I didn't pick up too much the first time. We'll go in with that face powder again. I'm just using the face tape powder from Tarte. It definitely cleans up the edges too, because it has a lot of pigment. Whereas the little single shadow I use from Wet n Wild in the shade Brulee, it's more subtle. Whereas this is definitely more pigment. I feel kind of blending that away. It kind of took away the orange a little bit, which I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that, because now it just looks like a brown kind of in there, but I'm completely okay. I feel like that shade's wanting to be a little patchy on this side. I keep trying to build it up and I'm probably making it worse. Take my finger and kind of blend it. I know that's weird, but if it works, maybe a little bit. I feel like it did really well over here, but over here it's wanting to look a little patchy. Might have been like where I didn't set my eyeshadow primer enough. Well, that doesn't look the greatest, but we're going to move on because I want to use this green shade. So instead of one of the golds, I'm going to use this shade right here in the palette, which that's the shade Guac. I'm going to take that on my finger. I just feel like we need to use a green in this palette instead of like the two golds. Boy, that's pigmented. And I feel like I didn't even pick up a lot on my finger, and that is full-on pigment. Pretty though. Yeah, I barely picked up any of that shade on my finger, and it's still intense pigment. Honestly, that green shimmer saved the day because I was not really that impressed with the matte shades that I was working with. I didn't like the orange, but that's more of a preference thing. And the brown was giving me a little bit of trouble on this eye, but it didn't bother me so much over here, so I'm guessing it's a me issue on this side. But I feel like the green shimmer saved it a little bit because that performed a lot better than the matte shades. Okay, I'm going to take my Smashbox and Becca Under Eye Corrector. And then I'm going to take my Ilia concealer. Okay, then I'm going to take a little bit of that shade Corn Salsa on a small angled brush from e.l.f. And I'm going to place that all along my lower lash line. I feel like this gold was the most pigmented out of the two of them that it picked. So I'm going to pick this one. It's like a really yellow gold. Okay, then I'm going to use the shade White Rice, and we're going to pop that right in here. Kind of blend that up in here too to brighten this part because I feel like when I first went in with that orange shade, I took it a little too much into there. I really want a nice brightness right in here. That's pretty. Honestly, the shimmers are good. I'm not impressed with the matte shades. Yeah, I love that pop of brightness. I think this is another palette that I would only keep a few shades. Because the palette as like an entire thing, I don't like some of these shades. Like, I would never wear that. I would never wear that. I didn't like this because it kind of got patchy on me. It could have been a me thing. Could have been a me thing. But the shimmer shades are really nice. So far, anyway. The ones I used. Honestly, this one, like I said, is the most unique. I'm going to swatch it for you. Can you see the shift? Might be hard to shade. That's the prettiest shade in the whole palette to me. I still think the shimmers are pretty, but honestly, I think that one shimmer shade is the prettiest one in the palette. I don't believe it's a palette that I'm going to keep. Maybe if I could get that one shade right there out of the palette, I'd keep that shade, but I don't really. The rest of the shades, I mean, while the shimmers are pretty, I don't know. I'm just not really feeling this eyeshadow palette, and I feel like if I feel that way, it's best for the palette to be passed on. I know a couple of friends that I can ask that they like green, and there are some greens in this, so I feel like they would like it better than I do. Like I said, I'd probably only try to keep that one shade that has kind of a pinkiness to it. And maybe even this White Rice shade because I do like that brightening moment, but other than that, it's not a palette that I feel like I would ever want to reach for again outside of those two shades. So I'm going to do the rest of my makeup and I will be right back. Okay, so here is this completed look. Okay, so right quick, before I talk about the eyeshadow palettes, what I'm wearing on my cheeks is the Haus Labs Color Fuse Glassy Blush Balm in Glassy Pomelo. I'm just using products from my everyday makeup drawer, and I feel like out of the three blushes, this one went the most with this eye look. And then on the lips, I'm wearing the Rare Beauty Kind Words Matte Lip Liner in the shade Worthy, and then the Lawless Satin Luxe Lipstick in Baby, but this one's been discontinued. I just kind of paired those two together and created this look. I honestly think that the shimmers in the eyeshadow palette are the best, but let's talk about both of these palettes because this was just the whole point in the video in revisiting. So let's first talk about the ABH since that's the first one I used. This palette, I only want like 4 shades. As a whole palette, I don't really want it. I mean, I just feel like some of these shades are definitely, I don't really want that shade. Some of these more yellow tones, while yellows can be so beautiful, I just know that I'm not really going to reach for them. Honestly, it's like I mentioned, my favorite shade in the whole palette is Cube, and then I'd like to keep Cube, Dawn, and then what is the shade? Electric, and then Mercury. I'd love to keep just those 4 eyeshadows from this palette because to me, they would make the perfect little quad, and I might do that. I think I actually might attempt to take this palette apart and keep the singles that I want and then pass on the rest of the palette because I feel like with just those 4 I would probably actually want to reach for it, but this palette as an entire unit I'm just not that interested in. I think it's a beautiful color story. It performs still just as beautiful as I remembered it, but I'm just not really feeling the whole entire palette. Okay, the e.l.f. and Chipotle eyeshadow palette. Like I said, the shimmers in this palette definitely saved the look for me because I feel like the mattes were just not it. I don't like that orange matte. That's just personal preference. And I just felt like I struggled a little bit with the deeper matte over here. That could have been me because I feel like I didn't have that issue on this side. It was just over here, so that probably was a me thing. But out of this palette, I really like this Fajita shade and the White Rice shade. These 2 shades right here. Honestly, those would probably be the only 2 shades I'd want in the palette. So maybe this is another one that I should take it apart and keep 2 singles out of it. I would love to start building a singles collection like from palettes. That way I don't have to keep the whole eyeshadow palette just to keep the shades that I want because I really like that Fajita shade when I swatched it out, and then of course I used the White Rice shade today like in the inner part and I love that shade. So honestly I would love to keep those 2 shades, so maybe that could be something I can do. Take these palettes apart and keep the shades that I really like, and then I can pass on the other shades that I know that I don't want to, like friends or family, because I feel like, honestly, since a lot of them are not as into makeup as I am, they probably would appreciate singles more so than even a whole actual palette. So we'll see what I decide to do, but right now, these palettes as an entire whole palette, I don't want them in my collection. But if I could take them apart and keep certain shades, then that would be what I'm going to do. But I'm glad that I did this because I definitely want to continue working through my makeup collection because I feel like this was a perfect way to see if I really wanted to keep these palettes or not, and this really helped me make up my mind on this. So going forward, I want to keep doing this on my channel. Just keep working through my collection, keep wearing these eyeshadow palettes and seeing how I truly feel about them. But I do hope that you enjoyed today's video, and if you did, I hope you will please consider leaving a like, a comment, or subscribing if you haven't already. Make sure you hit the bell icon so you are alerted to all my future uploads. All of these products will be listed and linked for you below. Well, outside of the eyeshadow palette, since they're no longer available, they will be affiliate links, so if you click through and purchase, I do earn a small commission, and if you choose to do so, thank you so much for supporting me and my channel, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!